High in the unforgiving, snow-capped mountains, a massive German shepherd suddenly froze, alerting his Navy SEAL handler to a hidden presence. Marcus stepped forward, expecting a deadly predator. Instead, he found the absolute impossible. Trapped beneath a heavy slab of ice was a terrified, injured fawn. And standing directly over it, acting as a living shield, was a tiny, starving stray dog. Shivering and bleeding, the fragile creature bared its teeth at the giant military dog, refusing to step back. It was ready to die for a total stranger. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. The wind howled through the jagged white peaks of the Rocky Mountains, carrying sharp ice crystals that stung the skin. Marcus pulled his thick collar up, trying to block the bitter cold. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, built solid from years of grueling military conditioning. His face was weathered, with deep-set, quiet eyes that held too many heavy memories. Today he wore his NWU Type 3 digital woodland camo, the green and brown fabric standing out sharply against the endless ocean of white snow. He walked with heavy, calculated steps. Beside him was Ranger. Ranger was a massive German shepherd, weighing nearly 90 pounds, with a thick black and tan coat, sharp upright ears, and highly alert eyes. Ranger was not just a dog, he was a trained working partner and the only company Marcus wanted out here. They were on day 3 of a severe winter survival course. The goal was simple: navigate back to the extraction point with minimal gear. Marcus was deeply tired. His legs felt like blocks of lead as he pushed through the knee-deep snow. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the mental weight he carried. It had been exactly 3 years. 3 years since he lost his best friend and teammate on a snowy ridge, very much like this one. The cold air always brought the memories rushing back. The sound of the wind reminded him of the rescue helicopter that had arrived too late. He remembered the cold silence that followed. Marcus paused and took a deep breath of the freezing air, trying to push the dark thoughts away. "Keep moving, Ranger," Marcus said, his voice raspy and dry. Ranger stopped and looked back. The big dog's intelligent brown eyes softened. He walked back to Marcus and nudged the man's frozen glove with his warm, wet nose. It was a simple, quiet gesture, but it grounded Marcus. "I know, buddy. I am okay," Marcus said. It was a lie. He was surviving, but he was not truly living. He was just moving forward because that was what he was trained to do. He forced his boots to take another step, then another. The pine forest was dead quiet. The only sound was the heavy crunch of their boots and paws breaking the icy crust of the snow. Suddenly, Ranger stopped dead in his tracks. His body went completely rigid. His nose twitched, pulling in the scent from the freezing air. The thick fur along his spine stood straight up. Marcus immediately noticed the change. "What is it?" Marcus asked softly. He reached down to his side out of pure habit, even though his weapon was not loaded with live rounds for this exercise. Ranger did not bark. He let out a very low, urgent whine. Then, without warning, the giant German shepherd bolted off the marked trail. He charged into the deep, untouched snow. "Ranger, heel!" Marcus commanded sharply. But the dog ignored him. Marcus frowned. That was incredibly rare. Ranger was a highly disciplined animal. If he broke a direct command, something was very wrong. Marcus sighed, watching his breath form a cloud of white mist, and chased after his partner. The snow was much deeper off the trail. Marcus struggled, pushing through frozen pine branches that snapped back and hit his arms. He followed the deep, hurried tracks Ranger left behind. The ground sloped downward here, leading toward a dark, rocky crevice at the base of a cliff. The air smelled different now, a mix of wet stone and wild animal. As Marcus got closer, he heard a sound over the howling wind. It was a high-pitched cry. It sounded weak, panicked, and desperate. Then he heard a growl. It was not Ranger's growl. Ranger's growl usually rumbled deep in his chest like a heavy engine. This new growl was small, sharp, and fierce. Marcus quickened his pace, his heart beating a little faster. Marcus pushed through the last line of snow-heavy trees and stopped. Ranger was standing at the edge of the rocky crevice, looking down. Marcus stepped up slowly beside him. Down in the narrow, hollow space between two massive boulders lay a fawn. It was a very young deer, its light brown coat still dotted with innocent white spots. It was shivering violently, its large dark eyes wide with terror. One of its fragile back legs was pinned tightly under a heavy, sharp rock that had fallen from the cliff above. The fawn was crying out in pain, unable to stand up. But the trapped deer was not what made Marcus hold his breath. Standing directly in front of the fawn, acting as a living shield against the giant German shepherd, was a dog. It was a stray mutt, incredibly small, reaching barely past Ranger's knees. It was painfully thin. Marcus could clearly see its ribs pushing through its matted, dirty coat. The small dog looked like it had not eaten a real meal in weeks. Its paws were raw and bleeding from the sharp ice. It was shivering so hard it could barely stand straight. Yet this tiny, starving, broken creature planted its bleeding feet firmly in the snow. It looked up at the 90-pound, highly trained German shepherd and bared its teeth. "Grrr," the little dog snarled, snapping its jaws. It was terrified, but it absolutely refused to take a single step back. Ranger tilted his head to the side, looking confused. He did not attack. He looked up at Marcus as if asking what to do with this angry little creature. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the scene. He felt a sudden, tight lump in his throat. This tiny animal was at the absolute end of its strength. It was starving and freezing to death. But instead of running away to save itself, it was risking its life to protect a helpless fawn from what it thought was a giant predator. It stood its ground against impossible odds. It instantly reminded Marcus of the very core rule of his brotherhood. You always protect the man next to you, no matter the cost. Marcus slowly lowered himself to one knee in the snow. He looked at the tiny, brave dog, and for the first time in 3 years, the heavy ice around Marcus's heart began to crack. "Ranger back," Marcus said. His voice was calm, but carried absolute authority. Ranger stopped his confused pacing. The massive German shepherd took 3 steps backward, sitting down in the deep snow, though his alert brown eyes never left the tiny, snarling dog. The standoff was broken. Marcus slowly stood up from his kneeling position. He kept his hands open and visible at his sides, moving deliberately. He took a slow, calculated step toward the rocky crevice. The little stray dog let out another warning growl, but the sound was noticeably weaker this time. His tiny body was shaking violently from the freezing wind and pure physical exhaustion. "Easy now," Marcus spoke softly. His deep voice cut through the howling wind, carrying a steady rhythm. "I am not the enemy. I'm just going to help." Marcus made sure not to look directly into the stray dog's eyes to avoid challenging him. Instead, he focused entirely on the trapped fawn. The young deer bleated, a pathetic high-pitched sound of pain and panic. Its delicate back leg was firmly pinned under a heavy slab of dark gray granite that had fractured off the cliff. Marcus knelt again, inspecting the rock and the angle of the leg. The stone was too heavy to simply lift without the risk of shifting it awkwardly and crushing the fragile bone completely. He needed a lever. Marcus stood up and looked around the frozen landscape. A few yards away, a dead pine tree had dropped a thick, sturdy branch half buried in the snow. Marcus walked over, his heavy boots crunching loudly. He picked up the branch. It was solid, frozen stiff, and strong enough to bear his weight. He carried it back to the crevice. The stray dog tensed up immediately, baring his teeth again at the sight of the large piece of wood, likely thinking it was a weapon. "It is okay," Marcus whispered, maintaining his slow, deliberate pace. He slid the thick end of the branch under the edge of the granite slab, right next to the fawn's trapped leg. Marcus found a smaller, rounded rock nearby and kicked it under the branch to act as a fulcrum point. He took a deep breath, letting the freezing mountain air fill his lungs, and pushed down heavily on his end of the lever. The muscles in his broad arms and shoulders strained against the weight. Slowly, with a rough, scraping sound, the heavy stone lifted. The fawn immediately felt the release of pressure. It kicked its legs frantically against the snow. "Hold on, almost there," Marcus grunted, pushing down even harder. The stone rolled backward, falling away from the fawn with a heavy thud that shook the ground. The young deer scrambled out of the crevice. It stumbled into the deep snow, tripped over its own hooves, and then finally found its footing. It stood up, shaking off the cold white powder. Marcus quickly checked its leg from a short distance. There was a nasty scrape, and a small patch of light brown fur was missing, revealing red skin, but the leg was straight. It was not broken. The fawn could walk. It took a few hesitant steps toward the edge of the tree line, then stopped, looking back at the stray dog. Marcus let out a long sigh of relief and dropped the wooden branch. He turned his attention back to the tiny defender. The stray dog was still standing perfectly still, watching the fawn with wide eyes. He watched the deer take its first safe steps, realizing the danger was finally gone. The moment the little dog knew the fawn was secure, his survival instinct shut off. The adrenaline that had kept him standing on bleeding paws simply vanished. His thin legs gave out instantly. He collapsed sideways into the freezing snow, making absolutely no sound. His eyes slid shut, and his breathing became frighteningly shallow. Marcus rushed forward, no longer caring about moving slowly. He dropped to his knees and pulled off his heavy winter gloves, tossing them into the snow. He reached out and gently touched the dog. The animal was freezing cold. There was barely any body heat left under the matted, dirty fur. Marcus gently scooped the tiny creature into his bare hands. The dog weighed almost nothing, feeling like just skin and brittle bones. "You have got a whole lot of spark in you, do you not?" Marcus murmured, looking at the bruised, raw paws. "Let us call you Spark." The dog did not move, barely clinging to life. Suddenly, the wind changed direction. It hit Marcus in the face like a solid wall of ice. He looked up at the sky. The pale gray clouds had turned to a violent, bruising black. The storm was a new, monstrous presence in the mountains. It moved incredibly fast, swallowing the jagged peaks above them in pure darkness. The temperature plummeted within seconds. A deep roaring sound echoed through the valley. It was not just a heavy snowfall, it was a massive winter blizzard, a brutal whiteout that would freeze anything left exposed. Marcus quickly reached into his tactical vest and pulled out his GPS device. He checked the distance to the extraction point. It was over 3 miles away across rough, elevated terrain. In clear weather, it was a hard, exhausting march. In a whiteout, it was a guaranteed death sentence. They could not make it. He had to make a command decision right now. Surviving meant finding cover immediately. Marcus unzipped the top half of his thick jacket. He carefully tucked the unconscious Spark inside, resting the tiny dog against the thermal base layer covering his chest. He zipped the jacket back up tightly, trapping his own body heat around the freezing animal. He could feel Spark's faint, rapid heartbeat against his ribs. Marcus turned to his partner. "Ranger, herd!" Marcus commanded, pointing sharply at the hesitating fawn. Ranger instantly switched from guard mode to working mode. He bounded through the snow, circling skillfully behind the frightened deer. He did not bark or bite. He simply used his massive physical presence to push the fawn in the direction Marcus pointed. Marcus scanned the immediate area, his eyes narrowing against the stinging wind. He remembered passing a rocky outcrop about half a mile back, a place where the cliff face leaned forward to create a natural, shallow shield against the wind. "Move! Let us go!" Marcus shouted over the rising roar of the storm. He started trudging back the way they came, his head down, forcing a path through the rapidly accumulating snow. Ranger stayed right behind the fawn. Whenever the young animal hesitated or stopped out of fear, Ranger nudged its back legs gently with his nose, keeping it moving steadily along Marcus's broken path. The sky unleashed its fury. Thick, blinding sheets of white snow fell from the black clouds, erasing the world around them. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet in a matter of minutes. The wind screamed through the pine trees, snapping dead branches and throwing ice crystals into their eyes. Marcus leaned forward, using his physical strength and sheer willpower to break through the heavy drifts. His legs burned with lactic acid, and his face went completely numb from the cold. Inside his jacket, he felt a tiny stir as Spark finally reacted to the human warmth. That small, fragile movement gave Marcus the extra push he needed. He was not just a soldier on a lonely training mission anymore. He was a protector leading his strange, fragile team through the deadly cold. They were racing against time, fighting the fury of the mountain, and Marcus was absolutely determined that not a single one of them would die in the snow today. He kept his head down, put one heavy boot in front of the other, and marched directly into the white void. The storm screamed against the jagged rocks, trying to push them off the mountain. Marcus kept his head down and pushed forward. His legs were completely numb. Inside his jacket, the tiny dog felt slightly warmer, a small sign of life against his chest. Behind him, Ranger used his large body to block the harsh wind for the limping fawn. Through the blinding white snow, Marcus finally saw the dark shape of the rocky overhang. It was a shallow cave, cut deep into the side of the cliff. "In here! Move!" Marcus yelled over the roaring wind. They hurried into the shelter. The difference was immediate. The howling wind was cut off, leaving only a dull roar outside. The air inside the cave was freezing, but it was still. Marcus dropped to his knees on the dry dirt floor. He unzipped his jacket with stiff fingers. He carefully took out the tiny stray dog and laid him softly on a bed of dry pine needles near the back wall. The dog was breathing steadily now, though his eyes were still closed. Ranger guided the exhausted fawn into the corner. The young deer immediately folded its long legs and laid down, shivering violently. They needed heat immediately. Marcus went to the very back of the cave, where old, dry branches and dead leaves had blown in over the years. He gathered a large pile in the center of the rocky floor. His hands shook from the cold as he reached into his tactical pouch. He pulled out a magnesium fire starter. He scraped the metal rod with the back of his knife. Bright orange sparks flew into the dry leaves. He blew gently. A thin line of gray smoke appeared. Then a small yellow flame caught. Marcus fed it small twigs, then larger branches. Within minutes, a strong, crackling fire lit up the dark cave. The orange light pushed back the shadows. The intense heat washed over Marcus's frozen face. He let out a long, heavy breath, finally feeling his tight muscles relax. The animals reacted to the fire instantly. The fawn shifted closer, closing its dark eyes as the warmth reached its shivering body. Ranger sat tall beside the flames, his thick fur absorbing the heat. Marcus sat on a rock and pulled a high-calorie survival ration block from his pack. It was dense and smelled like peanut butter and oats. He broke it in half. He tossed one large piece to Ranger. The big German shepherd caught it neatly in his mouth. Before Ranger could eat it, a weak sound came from the shadows. It was a low, raspy growl. Marcus turned his head. The tiny stray dog, Spark, was awake. He was still incredibly weak. His legs shook as he forced himself to stand. His raw, bleeding paws dragged in the dirt. But his eyes were locked on the food in Ranger's mouth. Spark wobbled forward, stepping right in front of the massive military dog. Spark bared his small teeth and growled again, trying to look dangerous. He snapped his jaws, demanding the food. He was a fraction of Ranger's size. Ranger stopped chewing. The huge dog looked down at the tiny, dirty creature. Then Ranger looked over at Marcus. Ranger let out a long, heavy sigh through his nose. He opened his jaws and gently dropped the piece of ration on the ground. Ranger took a step back and sat down, calmly letting the little dog have his meal. Spark immediately fell upon the food, eating frantically. "Good boy, Ranger," Marcus said softly, smiling for the first time in days. He broke his own half of the ration and tossed a piece to Ranger, who ate it happily. The fawn simply rested, too tired to care about the food. Night fell completely over the mountain. The storm outside raged on, creating a solid wall of black wind and white snow. But inside the cave, the fire burned bright and hot. Marcus sat quietly, wrapping a thick thermal blanket around his shoulders. He watched the flames dance. The crackling sound of the burning wood filled the silence. As the fire cast long, dancing shadows on the cave walls, Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. His mind drifted back exactly 3 years. He stared into the fire and remembered the face of his teammate, Elias. Elias was a heavily built man with a thick beard and a booming laugh that could fill any room. He was the bravest and most loyal man Marcus had ever known. On a night just like this, in a blizzard exactly like this, their team had been trapped on a mountain ridge. A local mountain guide had gotten lost in the whiteout. While the rest of the team sought shelter, Elias refused to leave the man behind. Elias had tied a rope around his waist, looked Marcus in the eye, and walked back out into the blinding storm. He never came back. They found Elias 2 days later, frozen, having given his own thermal jacket to the guide he had managed to find and save. The guilt had eaten Marcus alive every day since. He always felt he should have gone instead. He should have stopped his friend. The memory was a heavy stone he carried everywhere. Marcus looked away from the fire and glanced at the sleeping animals. Ranger was curled up in a tight circle. Tucked securely against Ranger's warm belly was the fawn. And right on top of Ranger's thick front paws, sound asleep, was Spark. The tiny dog's stomach was full, and he was finally warm. Marcus stared at the small, battered stray. He thought about what happened earlier that day. This tiny dog had stood in front of a giant German shepherd, ready to die to protect a fawn he did not even know. It was a completely selfless act. It was pure courage. Suddenly, the image of Spark standing over the deer merged with the memory of Elias walking into the storm. They possessed the exact same spirit. The little dog did not care about his own size or his own life. He only cared about protecting the weak. Marcus realized something profound in that quiet moment. Elias did not die because he was careless. He died because it was in his nature to protect, just like this little dog. You cannot change what is in a brave heart. For 3 years, Marcus had focused entirely on the loss. Now, looking at this strange, peaceful pack of animals, he finally saw the beauty of that courage. A single tear slipped down Marcus's weathered cheek, catching the firelight. He did not wipe it away. He laid his head back against the stone wall. For the first time in a very long time, the heavy weight in his soul felt a little lighter. He closed his eyes and listened to the steady, collective breathing of the 3 animals sleeping peacefully by the fire. Inside the shallow cave, the dead fire was still burning, casting a warm, flickering light across the snow-covered world. The brutal storm had finally passed, leaving behind a profound, freezing silence. Inside the shallow cave, the dead fire was nothing but a pile of cold gray ashes. Marcus opened his heavy eyes and took a deep breath. The freezing air stung his lungs, waking him up instantly. He sat up from the hard dirt floor and looked at his strange, patched-together team. Ranger was already awake, sitting tall at the entrance of the cave, scanning the bright white horizon like a dedicated sentry. The fawn was standing awkwardly on its 4 long legs, stretching its stiff, slightly bruised back leg. And right in the middle of the cave floor, curled into a tight, dirty ball, was Spark. The tiny stray dog was still breathing steadily. Marcus reached out and gently stroked Spark's matted head. "Time to move, little warrior," Marcus whispered. Spark opened his eyes, blinked at the bright sunlight, and slowly stood up. His raw paws were clearly causing him pain, but he did not whine. He just gave his tail a very small, hesitant wag. Marcus quickly packed his gear, feeling a strange new energy in his chest. The crushing weight of his past was still there, but it no longer paralyzed him. He walked out of the cave, stepping into snow that was now waist-deep. He looked up at their only way out. It was a massive, steep mountain ridge covered in a fresh layer of slick, treacherous ice. The original trail was completely gone, buried under tons of white powder. To reach the extraction zone, they had to climb straight up and over the broken path. It was a dangerous climb for a grown man, let alone a massive dog, an injured fawn, and a starving stray. "Listen up," Marcus said, looking at the 3 animals as if they were his own SEAL squad. "The path is gone. We are making our own way today. Stay close, step where I step, and do not look down." Marcus took the lead. He stepped onto the steep incline, using his heavy boots to kick solid steps into the packed snow. It was exhausting work. With every step, he had to crush the icy crust and pack the snow down to create a stable platform. Ranger followed right behind him, stepping carefully into the deep footprints Marcus left behind. However, the fawn immediately ran into trouble. Its long, thin legs sank deep into the loose snow. Because of its bruised back leg, the young deer could not push itself out of the holes. It stumbled, bleated in distress, and fell onto its chest. Ranger stopped. The big German shepherd looked back at the struggling fawn, then looked forward at Marcus. Without waiting for a command, Ranger pushed past Marcus. The 90-pound dog threw his massive chest forward, acting like a living snowplow. He dug his powerful legs into the mountain and pushed a wide, shallow trench through the deep snow. "Good boy, Ranger. Clear the way," Marcus said, stepping aside to let the big dog work. The fawn happily stepped into the smooth trench Ranger created. It was much easier for the young deer to walk now, but the fawn was still slow and frightened. That was when Spark took over his role. The tiny battered dog dropped to the very back of the line. He walked directly behind the fawn. Every time the deer stopped, frozen by fear or exhaustion, Spark would step up and gently nudge the fawn's back legs with his nose. If the fawn still refused to move, Spark would let out a sharp, commanding bark. Woof! The sound was small, but the attitude was massive. The fawn would jump slightly and start walking again. They formed a perfect tactical column, the heavy plow in the front, the vulnerable package in the middle, and the fierce rear guard pushing them forward. Marcus walked beside them, watching in absolute amazement. He had seen highly trained military units with less teamwork than these three mismatched animals. The climb grew harder as they reached the narrowest part of the ridge. The wind picked up again, blowing loose snow into their faces. The path here was barely 3 feet wide. On their left was a solid wall of dark gray rock. On their right was a sheer, terrifying drop into a deep valley below. The snow on this narrow ledge was very thin, covering a layer of smooth, black ice. Marcus felt his heavy boots slip slightly. "Hold up! Slow down here," Marcus warned, holding his hand out. Ranger slowed his pace, placing his large paws with extreme care. The fawn followed, its large, dark eyes wide with panic as it looked down into the deep valley. It took one step, then another. Suddenly, the fawn's bruised back leg gave out. The sharp hoof hit a patch of solid black ice. There was no grip at all. The fawn let out a terrified cry as its back leg slid completely out from under it. Its heavy body hit the slippery ground hard. The momentum carried the young deer backward, sliding directly toward the sheer drop. "No!" Marcus shouted, dropping his heavy pack and lunging forward. But the ice was too slick, and he was too far away. The fawn's back leg slid over the absolute edge of the cliff. It was going over. In a blur of dirty fur and pure desperation, Spark shot forward. The tiny dog did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He threw his lightweight body directly toward the sliding deer. He reached the edge, just as the fawn's head and shoulders were being pulled down by gravity. Spark opened his small jaws and clamped his teeth down hard onto the fawn's long, fuzzy ear. The fawn thrashed in panic, pulling Spark violently toward the empty air. Spark's raw, bleeding paws scraped frantically against the black ice, desperate for any kind of grip. He dug his claws in, lowered his center of gravity, and growled fiercely through his clenched teeth. He was being dragged closer and closer to the edge, his front paws literally hanging over the deadly drop, but he absolutely refused to let go of the fawn's ear. He was an anchor made of pure willpower. That crucial 2 seconds of delay was all Marcus needed. He threw himself onto his stomach, sliding headfirst down the icy slope. He slammed into the edge of the cliff, throwing his right arm out over the empty space. His thick, gloved hand grabbed the fawn's thick neck just as Spark started to lose his grip. "I got you! I got you!" Marcus roared. The muscles in his broad shoulders screamed as he took the full, dead weight of the struggling deer. With a massive heave, Marcus pulled his arm back, dragging the fawn up over the icy edge and onto the safe, flat rock. Spark let go of the ear and rolled backward onto the snow, gasping for air. Marcus scrambled to his knees, wrapping his arms around the shaking fawn to calm it down. He looked over at the tiny, exhausted stray dog lying on the ice. Spark's mouth was bloody and his chest was heaving, but he looked right back at Marcus with bright, defiant eyes. Marcus slowly reached out and wiped a spot of snow off Spark's head. "You crazy brave little fool," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking with a mix of adrenaline and deep emotion. "You really do not know how to quit, do you?" He scooped Spark up and held him tightly against his chest for a moment. They rested on the narrow ledge, catching their breath as the cold wind blew past them. The broken path was behind them now. The extraction point was getting closer, and for the first time on this mountain, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that they were all going to make it out alive. The group moved away from the deadly, wind-battered cliff edge and slowly descended into a dense forest of towering ancient pine trees. The environment changed drastically the moment they crossed the tree line. The howling wind that had tormented them all morning was suddenly blocked by the thick wooden trunks, leaving behind an eerie, heavy stillness. The pine trees grew incredibly close together, their dark green needles heavily weighed down by thick frozen layers of fresh snow. The bright morning sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy, casting long, confusing gray shadows across the untouched white ground. After the biting cold of the open ridge, the forest felt slightly warmer, but it was also unnervingly quiet. Marcus kept his pace steady, his heavy boots crunching softly, but his eyes constantly scanned the dark spaces between the trees. He noticed the absolute lack of ambient sound immediately. There were no winter birds chirping in the branches, no small animals scurrying along the rough bark, and no rustling of leaves. In the wild, absolute silence was rarely a sign of peace or safety. It was usually a massive, glaring warning sign. When the forest goes entirely quiet, it means something at the very top of the food chain is actively hunting. Marcus tightened his grip on the shoulder straps of his heavy pack and felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his neck. He looked back over his shoulder to check his strange, ragged team. The fawn was struggling. It was limping noticeably now, and a few small drops of fresh, bright red blood spotted the pure white snow from the scrape on its back leg. It was a very small amount of blood, but Marcus knew that in the frozen, hungry wilderness, that tiny metallic scent was a powerful beacon. It was enough to draw highly unwanted attention from miles away. Spark was walking practically underneath the young deer, his small, dirty head turning constantly left and right, clearly sensing the heavy, dangerous atmosphere pressing down on them. At the very front of the column, Ranger suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. The massive, highly trained German shepherd did not bark or whine. Instead, his entire muscular body went completely stiff, as rigid as a statue. The thick black and tan fur along his spine stood straight up in a sharp, aggressive ridge. He let out a warning growl so deep and rumbling that Marcus actually felt the vibration in his frozen boots before he properly heard the sound. Ranger stared intensely into the thick, dark branches of a massive dead pine tree about 30 yards ahead and slightly up the steep slope to their right. Marcus immediately followed the dog's locked gaze, his tactical training taking over. At first, he saw absolutely nothing but shifting shadows and heavy clumps of snow. Then, a distinct shape slowly detached itself from the thick wooden trunk. It was a mountain lion. The apex predator was a massive, heavily muscled feline, weighing easily over 150 pounds. Its thick, tawny brown coat perfectly matched the color of the dead pine bark, making it nearly invisible until it moved. It had a heavy, square jaw, incredibly powerful front shoulders built for taking down large prey, and cold, pale yellow eyes that were locked entirely on the limping, bleeding fawn. It moved with absolute, terrifying silence, creeping smoothly along a thick, snow-covered branch to get a better downward angle for a lethal strike. Marcus knew instantly that he had to act fast, but he was severely limited in his options. Out of pure military habit, his right hand immediately dropped to his tactical belt, resting on the grip of his heavy sidearm. However, his mind quickly caught up with his reflexes, and he immediately ruled out pulling the trigger. He looked up past the mountain lion at the steep, heavily snow-packed slope rising sharply above the tree line. The snow up there was a massive, heavy, and highly unstable slab, just waiting for a single excuse to break loose. A loud, echoing gunshot, or even a sudden, booming shout, would send a sonic shockwave right into that fragile snowpack. It would instantly trigger a massive, deadly avalanche that would sweep through the trees and bury them all alive under tons of ice. He needed to scare the big cat away, but he had to do it without creating a sharp shockwave. He slowly, deliberately moved his hand away from his weapon holster and reached up to a secure pouch on his chest rig. He pulled out a thick, heavy-duty red emergency flare. He kept his movements slow and incredibly smooth, desperately trying not to trigger the cat's predatory attack instinct with a sudden jerk. "Stay behind me. Do not move," Marcus whispered to the animals, his voice barely a breath of air. He gripped the rough plastic cap of the flare tightly, ready to strike the ignition pad, his eyes darting between the dangerous snow above and the deadly predator below. The mountain lion realized the humans and the large dog had spotted it. However, starvation made the animal bold, and it did not retreat into the shadows. It was starving, and the wounded, trembling fawn was an incredibly easy, guaranteed meal. The big cat's powerful hind muscles coiled tight like heavy steel springs against the tree branch. Its pale yellow eyes narrowed into focused slits. With incredible, terrifying speed and explosive physical power, the mountain lion launched itself directly from the high branch. It flew silently through the cold air in a long, deadly arc, its sharp, curved claws fully extended from its large paws, aiming directly to crush the fragile neck of the trapped fawn. But Ranger was already moving. The 90-pound German shepherd did not wait for a command from Marcus. He roared, a terrifying, deafening sound of pure canine aggression, and launched his massive body violently upward off his powerful hind legs to intercept the airborne threat. The two heavy apex predators collided violently in midair with a sickening heavy thud that knocked the breath out of both animals. The sheer physical weight and momentum of the mountain lion forced Ranger backward, but the dog's powerful, bone-crushing jaws snapped shut hard on the thick, loose skin of the cat's front shoulder. They hit the snow-covered ground together in a tangled mess, kicking up a massive, blinding white cloud of ice and dirt. A chaotic, violently brutal struggle instantly erupted. The mountain lion screamed, a high-pitched, horrifying alien sound, slashing frantically and wildly with its powerful back claws, trying to disembowel the dog. Ranger held his iron grip, completely ignoring the pain, shaking his massive head violently from side to side to disorient the large cat, using his incredibly thick double coat of fur as natural armor against the razor-sharp claws. Spark, despite his tiny size and bleeding, bolted backward in pure, blind terror, falling clumsily into a deep snowdrift. Spark, despite his tiny size and bleeding paws, bravely jumped directly in front of the panicked deer, barking furiously and wildly at the rolling ball of fur and teeth, desperately trying to distract the massive cat from its original target. Marcus ripped the cap off the emergency flare and struck the igniter pad as hard as he could. A blinding, violently bright red light immediately exploded into the dark shadows of the forest, hissing loudly and violently as it spewed thick, choking, sulphurous pink smoke into the cold air. He needed to break up the brutal fight immediately before Ranger was fatally wounded, but he also had to remain painfully aware of the silent, deadly threat of the unstable snow hanging just above their heads. The fight on the ground was a terrifying blur of tawny brown and black fur, a brutal ancient display of wild survival happening right at his feet. The dark pine forest was instantly bathed in a violent, blinding red light as Marcus struck the emergency flare. Thick, sulphurous pink smoke hissed loudly into the freezing air, creating a terrifying, unnatural cloud. Marcus did not just stand there. He stepped directly toward the brutal fight, thrusting the burning, hissing stick forward like a sword. "Get off him! Yeah! Get out of here!" Marcus roared, letting his deep, powerful voice echo as loudly as he could through the dense trees. The intense, burning heat of the flare, the blinding red glare, and the sudden, aggressive boom of a human voice broke the mountain lion's absolute focus. The apex predator shrieked, a terrible, high-pitched, ear-piercing sound of pure panic. It kicked violently with its heavily muscled back legs, finally throwing the 90-pound German Shepherd off its body. The big cat scrambled backward, its pale yellow eyes wide with sudden terror at the unnatural red fire sputtering in Marcus's hand. With a final angry hiss that showed its blood-stained fangs, the starving predator turned and bolted deeply into the dark shadows of the forest, disappearing completely into the thick brush within seconds. Ranger scrambled quickly to his feet, shaking his massive head and sending a spray of loose snow into the air. He had a nasty bleeding scratch across his thick left shoulder where the cat's claws had caught him, but he was alive, his eyes still locked aggressively on the tree line, standing firmly between the danger and the shivering fawn. Marcus let out a heavy, shaking breath, lowering the smoking flare slightly to check on his partner. "Good boy, Ranger. Hold your ground," Marcus panted, feeling the heavy adrenaline rushing through his veins. But the relief lasted for less than a single second. A new sound echoed through the silent forest, sharp and terrifying, cracking like a heavy artillery shell. Crack. Marcus snapped his head upward, his heart dropping into his stomach. The intense, chaotic noise of the brutal fight, the mountain lion's piercing shriek and Marcus's own booming shout had been far too much for the fragile, freezing environment. High above the tree line, perfectly hidden from their view, the heavy, unstable slab of packed snow finally fractured. A deep, low, horrifying rumble began to build, vibrating intensely through the thick soles of Marcus's heavy tactical boots. He watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as the white spaces between the tree branches above them began to shift. A massive, churning, unstoppable wave of heavy white ice, wet snow, and broken pine branches surged downward, picking up terrifying speed with every single yard. It was a localized avalanche, but in this dense, unforgiving forest, it was an absolute death sentence. "Avalanche! Move!" Marcus screamed at the top of his lungs, instantly dropping the burning red flare into the snow. He spun around wildly, his trained eyes frantically searching the immediate area for any kind of solid shelter. 10 yards away, slightly down the slope, a massive, ancient granite boulder stood firmly anchored deep into the mountainside. It was their only possible chance of surviving the crushing weight of the snow. Marcus lunged forward, his boots slipping on the icy ground, and grabbed the thick, heavy-duty handle on Ranger's tactical harness. He yanked the massive dog forcefully toward the rock. The fawn was completely paralyzed with fear, its wide, dark eyes staring blankly at the roaring white wall approaching from above. Marcus did not waste a second trying to herd it. He grabbed the young deer firmly around its midsection, lifting its awkward, kicking weight off the ground, and threw it roughly but safely behind the massive boulder. "Go! Go! Stay down!" he yelled, pushing Ranger in right behind the deer. Spark was already running, his tiny, battered legs pumping furiously to stay ahead of Marcus's heavy boots, instinctively seeking the safety of the rock. The roar of the avalanche was deafening now, a physical, crushing sound that completely drowned out every other noise in the world. Marcus shoved Ranger's heavy hindquarters entirely behind the solid stone and turned his body to dive into the narrow, safe space after them. But he was simply out of time. The violent, churning wall of heavy, wet snow hit the forest floor with the unstoppable force of a speeding freight train. The sheer impact snapped mature, thick pine trees around them like dry, fragile twigs. Marcus felt a solid, crushing wall of freezing white slam directly into his back. The immense physical force lifted his 200-pound frame entirely off his feet, as if he weighed absolutely nothing. He was thrown violently forward. He reached his arms out, his gloved hands desperately trying to grab the rough edge of the granite boulder, but the rushing, heavy snow dragged his lower body down. His left shoulder clipped the hard stone, spinning him wildly around, and then the side of his head slammed viciously against the solid base of the rock. A blinding, agonizing flash of white light exploded behind his eyes, followed instantly by a heavy, crushing wave of darkness. The avalanche washed completely over him, packing heavy, dense, wet snow tightly around his legs, his waist, and his chest. It felt exactly like thick, wet concrete pouring over his entire body, instantly freezing solid and locking his limbs perfectly in place. He landed awkwardly on his side, his face pressed heavily into a thick, icy crust of old snow. The roaring, rushing noise of the avalanche slowly faded into a dull, high-pitched ringing in his ears. The world violently stopped moving. The forest returned to a terrifying, deadly silence. Marcus was trapped. He was buried waist-deep in the heavily compacted snow, his lower body completely immobilized and instantly going numb. The heavy, violent blow to his head made his brain feel thick, heavy, and completely disconnected from his body. He tried weakly to move his arms, but he had absolutely no strength left. He tried to lift his head, but the solid ice beneath his face was painfully, bitingly cold, numbing his skin and slowly, steadily freezing his lips together. He felt the terrifying, warm, deceptive blanket of severe hypothermia starting to wrap heavily around his confused mind. It was so incredibly easy to just keep his eyes closed. It was so perfectly quiet now. The sharp, throbbing pain in his head was fading rapidly, replaced by a deep, dangerously comfortable urge to simply fall asleep. He was drifting away, losing his final grip on consciousness, resigning himself quietly to the cold, peaceful dark. Suddenly, a sharp, frantic, scraping sound pierced directly through the heavy, gray fog in his dying brain. It was right next to his right ear. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Marcus forced his heavy, freezing eyelids open just a fraction of an inch. His vision was blurry, swimming in dark spots. A small, frantic, blurry shape was moving violently right in front of his face. He felt something warm, wet, and metallic hit his frozen cheek. It was a drop of fresh blood. Then another. He slowly focused his tired eyes. It was Spark. The tiny, starving stray dog was standing right in front of Marcus's trapped face, digging furiously and wildly at the hard, compacted ice that threatened to completely cover Marcus's nose and mouth. Spark's extremely small paws were an absolute mess. The razor-sharp ice crystals were brutally slicing into his already raw, damaged pads, causing them to bleed freely and heavily onto the pristine white snow right in front of Marcus's eyes. But the little dog absolutely refused to stop. He whined, a desperate, high-pitched, heartbreaking sound of pure anxiety, and kept digging frantically, clearing the heavy snow away so the fallen soldier could breathe. Ranger was there too, standing behind Spark, his massive, powerful jaws securely clamped onto the heavy shoulder fabric of Marcus's tactical vest. The giant German shepherd was pulling backward with all his incredible, muscular strength, desperately trying to drag his handler out of the frozen, concrete-like trap. But the snow was far too heavy for Ranger alone. Ranger's powerful, steady pulls were keeping the deadly snow from settling further over Marcus's chest, but it was tiny Spark who was actively saving Marcus's life in that exact desperate second. Spark stopped digging for a fraction of a second, leaned down, and licked Marcus's freezing, numb face with his warm, rough tongue right over the bleeding cut on Marcus's forehead. Then the tiny dog went right back to digging, literally tearing at the hard ice with his small teeth when his bleeding paws slipped. The sheer, desperate, unyielding determination in that tiny, starving, broken animal sent a sudden, massive, powerful jolt of pure, fiery adrenaline straight through Marcus's slowing heart. He could not die here. He absolutely could not let this brave, selfless little creature watch him give up and freeze to death. Marcus took a deep, jagged, painful breath of the freezing cold air that Spark had desperately cleared for him. He firmly clenched his jaw, feeling the sharp, blinding pain in his head flare up again, and finally began to fight back against the ice. "I am awake," Marcus groaned loudly, his voice incredibly weak and raspy, but undeniably alive. Spark let out a sharp, joyful, ringing bark and dug even faster, his bloody paws a beautiful, heartbreaking testament to a loyalty that absolutely knew no bounds. The freezing snow gripped Marcus's lower half like a vice, but the sight of the tiny, bleeding paws frantically digging at the ice right in front of his face ignited a massive, fiery surge of adrenaline in his veins. Marcus gritted his teeth, completely ignoring the sharp, throbbing pain echoing inside his skull from the impact with the rock. He pushed his heavy, gloved hands flat against the compacted snow directly over his chest and shoved upward with every single ounce of strength he had left. The solid crust of ice cracked slightly, sending spiderwebs of fractures through the white wall. Ranger felt the sudden, desperate movement. The massive German shepherd dug his thick claws deeply into the rock-solid ground, planted his muscular back legs wide, and pulled backward on Marcus's heavy tactical vest with a terrifying, raw, physical force. "Pull, Ranger! Pull!" Marcus grunted loudly, twisting his waist violently from side to side to break the heavy suction of the wet snow. A loud, tearing sound echoed against the stone as the frozen trap finally gave way. Marcus slid backward rapidly, kicking his numb legs entirely free from the icy grave, and collapsed heavily onto his back on the safe, solid dirt behind the massive granite boulder. He lay there for a long moment, staring up at the gray winter sky, gasping desperately for the freezing, thin mountain air. His lungs burned intensely, but the cold air tasted like pure life. He rolled slowly onto his side, his muscles screaming in violent protest, and looked around the tight, shadowed space. The massive boulder had done its job perfectly. The crushing avalanche had swept directly over the top of the rock, leaving them perfectly safe in a small, secure pocket beneath the snowpack. Ranger immediately let go of the tactical vest and began licking Marcus's face, whining softly and anxiously to check his handler for serious injuries. Behind them, the young fawn was pressed tightly against the cold stone, shivering violently from fear, but completely unharmed. However, Marcus's immediate attention was drawn entirely to the tiny, filthy stray dog lying exhausted on the ice. Spark had completely collapsed the absolute second Marcus was pulled free. The little dog's thin chest was heaving rapidly, his eyes were half closed, and his small front paws were leaving bright, alarming red stains on the pristine white snow. Marcus knew he had to act immediately, or the brave little animal would lose too much blood and freeze to death in a matter of minutes. Marcus forced himself into a sitting position, aggressively ignoring the heavy dizzy spell that washed over his bruised brain. He unclipped his heavy tactical backpack, his stiff, freezing fingers fumbling clumsily with the hard plastic buckles. He ripped open the medical pouch and pulled out a thick roll of sterile white gauze, a small plastic tube of antiseptic ointment, and a pair of heavy-duty trauma shears. "Come here, little buddy. Let me fix you up," Marcus said softly, his deep voice shaking with raw, unfiltered emotion. He reached out and gently lifted the tiny, exhausted dog onto his lap. Spark did not try to fight him or growl. The little dog simply rested his dirty, matted head heavily against Marcus's chest and let out a long, weak sigh of complete surrender. Marcus took a deep breath and began to carefully inspect the physical damage. The razor-sharp ice crystals had brutally sliced the rough black pads on both of the dog's front feet. Marcus applied a thick, generous layer of the clear, stinging antiseptic ointment directly to the open cuts. Spark flinched slightly and let out a very low, pathetic whimper, but he bravely stayed perfectly still, trusting the soldier completely. "I know it hurts. You're doing great. Just hold on tight," Marcus whispered continuously, wrapping the thick white gauze securely around the small paws, creating makeshift winter boots to stop the bleeding and keep the severe cold out. As Marcus secured the very end of the bandage with a strip of strong medical tape, he shifted his left hand to support the back of the dog's neck. His bare fingers sank deep into the incredibly thick, greasy, tangled fur beneath the dog's chin. Suddenly, his fingertips brushed against something hard and completely foreign to the soft skin and rough hair. It was not a frozen burr or a hard clump of dried pine sap. It felt exactly like cold, solid metal. Marcus frowned slightly, his tactical mind instantly curious. He gently pushed the thick, dirty layers of matted fur aside, working his fingers deeper into the collar line. Hidden entirely beneath years of dirt and tangled hair was a thin, heavily frayed, dark green nylon collar. It was so tight and buried that it was entirely invisible from the outside. Attached to a rusted metal D-ring on the collar was a small, circular piece of metal. It was a dog tag. Marcus felt a sudden, strange, heavy tightness in his chest. A stray dog out here in the brutal wilderness was incredibly rare, but a stray dog wearing a tag meant someone, somewhere, had once loved this animal. Marcus carefully pinched the small metal circle between his thumb and forefinger and gently pulled it forward into the pale winter light. The tag was completely covered in a thick, hard layer of dried mud, dark brown rust, and old, sticky pine resin. The words were completely illegible. Marcus quickly grabbed a small plastic bottle of sterile saline solution from his open medical kit. He squirted a generous pool of the clear liquid directly onto the dirty metal surface. Using his rough, calloused thumb, he pressed down hard and began to rub the mud away, scraping his fingernail against the stubborn rust to reveal the history hidden beneath. Slowly, piece by piece, the dark grime began to dissolve and flake away, revealing the dull, scratched silver metal beneath. Deeply engraved letters began to catch the faint gray sunlight filtering through the trees. Marcus squinted his eyes, tilting the small tag slightly to read the worn text. The very first line became clear. It read, "Buster." Marcus stopped uncontrollably. He frantically rubbed the uncontrollably. He frantically rubbed the bottom half of the tag, desperately clearing the rest of the mud away to read the second line. The letters stared back at him, absolute and undeniable. Owner, Elias. Marcus stared at the small piece of metal as if it were a literal ghost. Elias? His best friend, his fallen teammate. Elias was a massive, broad-shouldered man with a thick, untamed beard, an incredibly loud, booming laugh, and a heart that cared entirely too much for the broken things in the world. The memories flooded Marcus's mind with the violently crushing force of the avalanche he had just survived. Exactly 3 years ago, during that fateful, deadly training mission in these exact same mountains, Elias had brought his newly adopted, scrawny rescue dog along for the initial hike before the severe blizzard hit. When the storm swallowed the mountain and the absolute chaos erupted, the frightened little dog had bolted into the whiteout, lost completely to the blinding snow. Elias had died later that night trying to save the lost local guide, and everyone on the team assumed the tiny, fragile dog had frozen to death within hours. But he had not. Buster had survived. For 3 agonizingly long, freezing, brutal years, this tiny, seemingly broken animal had lived entirely alone in the harshest environment on Earth. He had fought off starvation, survived brutal winter storms, and battled apex predators. But most importantly, he had never lost the fundamental spirit of the Navy SEAL who had rescued him. He was still actively protecting the weak, standing fiercely between deadly danger and the completely innocent, exactly like his master had done until his dying breath. Marcus dropped the tag into the snow, into the the heavy, impenetrable wall of stoic military discipline that Marcus had built tightly around his broken heart for 3 years, instantly shattered into a million pieces. He pulled the tiny bandaged dog tightly against his chest, burying his weathered, bruised face deeply into the dirty, foul-smelling fur. "Buster?" Marcus sobbed, his deep voice completely breaking and cracking. "You stayed. You stayed on mission." The hardened, towering Navy SEAL sat in the freezing snow and wept openly, his broad shoulders shaking violently with years of repressed grief, crushing guilt, and overwhelming relief. Ranger walked over quietly and pressed his massive, warm head gently against Marcus's back to comfort him, while the little fawn watched silently from the shadows. Marcus cried until his throat was raw, tightly holding the absolute last living piece of his best friend, finally understanding that Elias had never truly left him on this mountain at all. The brutal, freezing wind had completely died down by the time Marcus finally stood up from behind the massive granite boulder. His entire body ached violently. His muscles were stiff, his left shoulder throbbed with a dull, heavy pain, and a sharp headache still echoed from where his skull had struck the hard stone during the avalanche. Yet as he held the tiny, bandaged dog tightly against his chest, Marcus felt lighter than he had in 3 agonizing years. The crushing, suffocating weight of guilt that had permanently lived in his chest was simply gone. He looked down at his mismatched, battered team. Ranger was standing tall and alert, shaking the last bits of frozen snow from his thick double coat. The fawn was leaning against the rock, tired and limping, but completely alive. "Let us go home," Marcus said quietly. His deep voice did not shake any more. It was steady, calm, and full of clear purpose. They began the final, slow descent down the mountain. The pine forest gradually began to thin out, and the thick, suffocating shadows gave way to a brilliant, blinding expanse of flat, untouched white snow. It was a massive open valley nestled between 2 sharp peaks. Marcus heard the mechanical sound long before he saw the source. A rhythmic, heavy thumping echoed through the crisp winter air, vibrating deep in his chest. As they finally broke through the absolute edge of the tree line, Marcus saw it. Sitting squarely in the center of the frozen valley was a dark gray MH-60S Nighthawk helicopter. Its massive top rotors were spinning steadily, kicking up a fierce, swirling cloud of loose white powder. It was the extraction point. They had finally made it. 2 figures immediately stepped out from the blowing snow, jogging quickly toward the tree line to meet them. The first was Chief Miller, the helicopter's veteran flight medic and crew chief. Miller was a stocky, broad-shouldered man with a thick, graying mustache and calm, highly analytical eyes hidden behind a dark flight visor. He moved with the quick, efficient grace of a man who had seen decades of combat rescue. Beside him was a new face. It was Sarah, a local wildlife rescue specialist who had been monitoring the wilderness perimeter during the military survival exercise. "Put people at ease." Miller reached Marcus. "Put people at ease." Miller reached Marcus first, his sharp eyes instantly scanning the Navy SEAL from head to toe for any severe trauma. "We saw the avalanche register on the thermal imaging satellites. We thought the mountain had swallowed you whole," Miller shouted, his voice barely cutting over the loud roar of the helicopter engines. Marcus shook his head and offered a tired but incredibly genuine smile. "Not today, Chief. We found a safe pocket, but I picked up some extra cargo along the way," Marcus replied smoothly. Miller stopped and stared. He looked at the massive German shepherd, then down at the injured, shivering fawn standing awkwardly in the snow, and finally at the tiny, filthy, bandaged dog resting peacefully in Marcus's arms. The hardened crew chief let out a loud, booming laugh of pure disbelief. "You always were a magnet for strays, Marcus. Let us get you all out of the cold," Miller said, waving them forward toward the waiting aircraft. The smell of burning jet fuel mixed sharply with the clean, freezing mountain air, signaling the absolute end of the brutal survival test. Sarah walked over slowly, deliberately keeping her posture low and non-threatening so she would not trigger the fawn's wild prey instincts. She dropped gracefully to one knee in the deep snow. "You have had quite a terrifying journey, little one," Sarah murmured in a very soft, soothing voice. She expertly and gently ran her gloved hands over the fawn's back leg, feeling the muscle and bone. "It is just a deep, nasty bruise and a superficial scrape from the rocks. There is absolutely nothing broken. We will take her back to the sanctuary center, patch up that scrape, give her a warm place to rest, and release her safely back to a local herd before the spring thaw," Sarah explained clearly to Marcus. Marcus nodded, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over him. His mission to protect the innocent creature was completely successful. As Sarah gently reached out her arms to lift the deer, the wild animal hesitated. The fawn pulled back slightly, ignoring the rescue worker for a moment. It hobbled forward awkwardly on its 3 good legs and stepped right up to Marcus. The young deer lowered its small spotted head toward Marcus's chest, right where Buster was safely tucked inside the warm jacket. Buster was completely exhausted, but his small ears perked up at the movement. He poked his dirty, battered head out of the coat. The fawn gently and deliberately pressed its wet, black nose directly against Buster's rough face. It was a quiet, incredibly moving gesture. It was a silent display of pure gratitude between two fragile survivors who had faced death together. Buster let out a tiny, soft sigh and gently licked the side of the fawn's nose in return. Having said its final goodbye to its fierce little protector, the wild deer turned calmly back to Sarah. Sarah scooped the fawn up carefully into her arms and carried it toward a waiting, heated medical transport vehicle parked just near the tree line. Marcus stood quietly in the snow, watching them go, knowing the deer was finally entirely safe. "Time to fly, brother," Miller yelled, slapping Marcus firmly on the shoulder and pointing to the open side door of the heavy transport helicopter. Marcus climbed aboard the cold metal floor of the aircraft. Ranger jumped in effortlessly right behind him, instantly taking his highly trained position, lying flat and calm on the steel deck. Marcus sat heavily in the canvas jump seat, pulled the heavy safety harness over his broad shoulders, and securely strapped himself in. He carefully unzipped his jacket and settled Buster comfortably on his lap, wrapping a thick gray thermal blanket tightly around the small dog to keep him warm. The pilot engaged the throttle. The helicopter engines roared to full life, the mechanical noise building into a deafening, vibrating crescendo that shook the entire frame. The heavy aircraft lifted smoothly off the frozen ground, banking sharply upward and flying directly over the endless sea of white pine trees. Marcus turned his head and looked out the small, scratched window. The jagged, terrifying peaks of the snowy mountain range slowly shrank into the distance. For 3 long, agonizing years, Marcus had looked at those exact mountains and seen only a massive, unbreakable, freezing tomb. He had been convinced that the brutal mountain had stolen everything good and brave from his life. But as he looked away from the window and down at the tiny, sleeping dog in his lap, the heavy darkness completely vanished from his soul. The mountain had taken Elias, yes, but it had not destroyed him. It had protected Elias's legacy. It had tested this tiny, frail animal against the harshest conditions on Earth and forged him into a true protector, keeping a vital, living piece of Elias's selfless spirit alive against impossible odds. Marcus gently rested his rough, calloused hand on Buster's rising and falling chest. He felt Ranger's heavy, comforting chin drop firmly onto his heavy, tactical boot. Marcus realized he was no longer just surviving day to day. He was truly living again. He did not just save a helpless deer and a starving stray dog on this brutal mountain. He had found absolute forgiveness for himself. He had found lasting peace. As the helicopter flew rapidly toward the breaking golden light of the horizon, Marcus closed his eyes and smiled, knowing with total certainty that they were finally, truly going home to start a beautiful new life together. If this story touched your heart today, please share this video with a friend or a family member who might really need a reminder of hope and resilience. I would absolutely love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where an animal brought you profound comfort or taught you a lesson in bravery? Please tell me your own story in the comments below. I read every single one. And please do not forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you more inspirational stories that celebrate the unbreakable, beautiful bond between humans and animals. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next story.